Get your Mr. and Mrs. Bourbon ready to go. We're back again for another Starting 502 podcast brought to you by Mr. and Mrs. Bourbon. You can find Mr. and Mrs. Bourbon anywhere basically in the state of Kentucky, or if you're outside the state of Kentucky, you can find it online at store.mrandmrsbourbon.com. Jay Cook, how are we tonight?
Good, confused, unsure where to place judgment at this point. So trying to be patient, I think right now is the best thing, because I think it's really easy to be reactionary and be like, oh, that's terrible, that's awful, what's Josh Schertz doing? So trying to be patient, letting everything play out, analyzing whoever the hire ends up being, and not just immediately coming out with an opinion, which is hard.
It's very hard. We're currently recording at 10:30 Eastern Standard Time on March 26, 2024. I think you have to preface every conversation with this because, for instance, you and Jacob did a podcast on Saturday night. Very appreciative of Jacob stepping in. I had a hell of a day. No way I was getting on there that late at night. But I thought your all's podcast was great. I thought you guys covered a lot of great stuff. But by Sunday morning, when I flipped it on, the first 20 minutes were irrelevant. Literally. So I was like, this is great. Like this, once you get past the 20-minute mark, this is great. But the first stuff, the very first things that you guys talked about, like those were already struck down as soon as I think it was, we were talking about, you guys kept going back and forth about, Dusty May and what the situation was there. And you kept speculating maybe they offered him like $6 million a year or something like that.
That's what
turned out to be like 3.5, 3.25, something like that. So, I mean, ultimately, and just to touch base very quick. So just to bring everybody up to speed where we are, the last time we left off with you guys, Saturday night, the wee hours of the morning into Sunday morning, we had just found out that Dusty May accepted a job in Michigan, to everyone's surprise, including Josh Schertz, which we'll get to here in a second. So that is where we left you guys off. It is now Tuesday, and things have changed significantly. A major name, major name is as far as literally the name has entered the fold. Maybe not major as far as success or current big names in the coaching search field. So we'll get into that in just a second. So basically all day Sunday, we're just trying to figure out what's going on. Dusty May signs a contract, like we said, for, basically about what you would expect Louisville, Michigan, Vanderbilt, any of these schools to offer him, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it sounded like, Louisville's not going to budge on some of these quote unquote smaller name guys, right? Like a Scott Drew, name a big name coach out there that would the market would dictate that they ask for $8-9 million. Louisville Billy Donovan, something like that. They threw the kitchen sink at Scott Drew. He basically said no, but that doesn't mean that they're just going to throw the kitchen sink at everybody, right? And I think that that's an important thing to take into consideration during this coaching search. So, as we're continuing, a lot's coming out. Monday morning, Bob Valvano comes on the air and says that he's had some very serious conversations in person when he covered Josh Schertz's game at Indiana State, who is currently playing right now in the NIT against Cincinnati, down by 4 as we speak. Enjoying watching this Indiana State game. We can get into that a little bit. But also really just kind of dropped this huge bomb that kind of set off a real trickle effect. And he kind of said it in passing. And I think that as soon as he said it and he saw the reaction, he felt really bad about what was said, but basically indicated that Dusty May saw that there was like death threats against his family or something like that. And so that was a huge thing on Louisville Twitter and in the spaces and all that stuff. And then all of a sudden at the same time on Monday, a new name emerges, Richard Pitino. And I'll be the first to say, hand up, I was the first guy, every time somebody mentioned Richard Pitino, I was the first guy to come out and say, no shot, 0% chance that a Pitino would ever want to be associated with this university. And look, I mean, as far as I'm aware, and we can go back and fact check this, but I'm pretty sure there's still some sort of litigation going on between Rick Pitino and the University of Louisville. As of right now, as far as I understand, Louisville still hasn't paid a dime to Rick Pitino. it's their stance that they fired him with cause. However, 5 years later, Rick Pitino was vindicated in the court of law. And basically, it was found that he was, exonerated. He was completely innocent of any wrongdoing, according to the court of law. Now, according to the NCAA, what happened at Louisville was repugnant, was the word that they used, and disgusting, and whatever else. Ultimately, we don't have to go down that road. In my opinion, I don't think that Louisville cheated in a way that it gave them a leg up on the competition. There wasn't a single person that played in the NCAA tournament in 2012, 2013 that, or, throughout any of those seasons, that benefited from what went on at Louisville. Was it right? Probably not. But was it cheating? Was it skirting the rules? Was it like Will Wade's strong ass offer? Was it any of that stuff? No. But also at the same time, you still had the pay for play thing going on with Brian Bowen. Pitino was caught up in that. Ultimately had to leave, not on the best terms. And, one would think, Richard Pitino grew up with Rick Pitino and Joanna Pitino. I believe that's Rick's wife's name. He grew up under their roof. And so not that he has to answer to them, he's a 41-year-old man. He's
younger than you think, because he's been coaching for so long.
12 years. He's got 12 full seasons under his belt, Jake. But you have Richard Pitino. You would think, because of everything that went down at Louisville, that he's just a non-starter, that's just not an option. But it comes out on Monday, there's been talks, and the talks have been serious. And Richard Pitino, it sounds like, from everything that we're hearing, he wants the job. At the same time, it comes out that around the same time, it comes out that Josh Schertz, sorry, there's so many names. I get first and last names confused. You got Josh Hurd, you got Josh Schertz. At the same time, it comes out that Josh Schertz, again, the head coach at Indiana State, who's currently playing in the NIT right now down by 3 to Cincinnati, and making a charge. Yeah, it comes out that Josh Schertz has signed an MOU. That's what we're told. Jake, did you know before today what an MOU was?
As a man who's never taken a single class in law school, no, I had no idea. I had to look it up.
An MOU stands for Memorandum of Understanding. And according to Google, it is considered a non-binding agreement between 2 or more parties that outlines each party's expectations or intentions. MOUs are often the first step towards a binding contract. However, it's said to be a non-binding contract. Now, from what I'm seeing, what I'm hearing, what logic would dictate is that Josh Schertz is still under contract at Indiana State. They just tied the game right now. Like, he's jumping up and down on the sidelines as I speak. So clearly this man is under contract at Indiana State. And so you have him under contract with his current job, but he's also signed some sort of document that says basically he is bound by this agreement that St. Louis isn't going to go after any other coaches, and he has every intent of going to St. Louis. Now, it's also my understanding that there's been a precedent set before, mostly in college football, where head coaches, have been able to get out of this in the past. They've signed something like an MOU. I've seen MOA out there. I don't even know what MOA stands for, but people have mentioned an MOA as well. So maybe it's that. Whatever the case.
Memorandum of agreement, I assume. Agreement instead of understanding. I assume it's the same thing.
I guess so. And I even, tweeted at Keith Pointer, who is the Ville Sports Law on Twitter. He sometimes makes appearances on local radio because this is Louisville, and it seems like every other year we have to go over stupid legal stuff at this point to understand what the hell's going on. So it comes out, Mike Rutherford, a couple other sources that, everybody would trust, comes out and basically says that Josh Schertz is the guy for the job. It's out there that he wants the job. Louisville has pegged him as the next head coach, and that he would have to turn the job down in order for Louisville to go with anybody else. Outside of that, Richard Pitino, and then Pat Kelsey at College of Carlson of Char.
And you and your strokes, brother.
College of Charleston. Pat Kelsey, College of Charleston would be maybe the third option as well. And national media members have come out. I don't know if I trust Jeff Goodman as much as others, just because he has such a strong connection with Pat Kelsey. Pat Kelsey of the Chris Mack coaching tree, a guy that is around a lot of these national media guys. He has their ear. And so they go to bat for their guy, right? So with all that in mind, you got this Josh Schertz stuff out here. You have Tim Sullivan coming out today and saying that he doesn't think that it's a done deal yet that Josh Schertz is going to St. Louis. But so much steam in the meantime is picked up for Richard Pitino. And I don't know. Give me your initial thoughts on Richard Pitino, because there's so many different directions you could go with this. I initially look at it and think that, if Louisville's looking for a guy that has a proven track record of getting teams to the NCAA tournament, having 25, 30 win seasons, a consistent winner. And to be honest with you, Richard Pitino has not been that so far in his career. He's had some ups, but he's had a lot of downs. His last 6 seasons at Minnesota, his records are not pretty. And he was basically, he had a mutual parting of ways in Minnesota, but basically canned at Minnesota and then was picked up by New Mexico. So initial thoughts on Richard Pitino?
I believe I saw it and I quote tweeted and said, "Please God, no." And that was the reactionary stuff that I'm trying not to do. But I mean, that was truly my initial reaction. I mean, to me, it seems like a guy who is being looked at because of his last name. Because if you look at it compared to the candidates we have now, Josh Schertz or Pat Kelsey, or any of the other coaching candidates we had, Jerome Tang, Nate Oates, Eric Musselman, the record is just not there at all. These coaches, like Eric Musselman's setting it like almost a 70% win percentage. Jerome Tang even higher, or was before the end of the Kansas State year. But all these coaches that we're looking at are at like 65% win percentage, 68%, 70, something like that. And then we've got him, who's tried it at a high program at Minnesota, and he's got a 553 win percentage. He's had 3 losing seasons at Minnesota. He made it to the NCAA tournament twice with them in 8 years, I believe, and had a good team last year in New Mexico that tailed off at the end, missed the tournament. And now this year they were going to miss the tournament, but they won their conference championship. So they made it. Everyone's picking him as a darling. Everyone's like, oh yeah, Clemson's bad. No chance. New Mexico's going to make it to the Sweet 16. They're going to beat Baylor in the second round. They get fucking shit pumped. Like, it was never a game at all. They looked really, really, really bad to Clemson, who, by the way, Clemson does look good. Clemson looked really good against Baylor. But I've watched this Clemson team all year long. They're not that good. So my initial reaction was unimpressed, thoughts of nepotism, the last name's getting him the job, nostalgia is getting him the job. I looked a little bit more into it. He does have some players that could come with him, like a Jamal Mashburn Jr. or Donovan Dent, who both average 14 points a game. So that would be a little interesting. You get 2 really solid guards to come with him, and maybe even a couple of other guys. They're pretty well balanced this year, 54th in offensive efficiency, 27th in defensive efficiency. They played in the tough conference in the Mountain West. They got 7 teams in the tournament. So I can probably talk myself into any coaching candidate, but to me, I still don't think Richard Pitino is the guy. If he ends up being the guy, I'll follow it. I'll support it. I'll be there. But to me, I think Josh Schertz and Pat Kelsey are above him in my eyes.
Yeah, and to your point, there's not a guy out there at this point that's not going to come with baggage. There's not somebody there that's not going to have 2, 3, 4, 5 red flags. There's not a coaching hire that you're going to make at this point in the coaching search that doesn't give you some pause. So I think that's the first thing to take into consideration. Let's get the negative stuff out of the way first with Richard Pitino, because I think a lot of the conversation here is going to center around him. He started out pretty strong at Minnesota. So first of all, just to back it up just a little bit, he left from Louisville, his second stint at Louisville in 2012, and went to Florida International. And at Florida International, he saw really solid success. He had I think like a 25 win season at FIU.
18 and 14.
18 and 14. Okay. So not quite. Sorry. So he had 18 wins.
Solid.
It's still solid, especially given the state of the program when he arrived. They were not good when he arrived, and they were really good for their standards in one season at FIU. Good enough to get him a Power 5 coaching job. I believe at the time the youngest coach to ever accept a Power 5 coaching job, but it was at a Big Ten bottom dweller in Minnesota. When he took that job at Minnesota, they were a very strong team right off the bat. Almost made the NCAA tournament, just missed out, went to the NIT, and then had a great run in the NIT and ended up winning the NIT. And everybody, I don't know if you remember back in the day, that was when, Pitino was still here. He still had things really rolling for Louisville. And he was actually there in the Garden back when they played the NIT in the Garden. And it was a fun time for everybody because Louisville fans were reminiscing on the great days with Rick and Richard on the bench. It was great just to pull for a guy like that, a guy that everybody around here still loves. I mean, considering all that's happened with Pitino with the Pittinos at Louisville, that there's still a ton of support for them. I would say, if he would come back, I think a lot of fans would take Rick Pitino right now. It's just not something that would ever happen because of everything that went down. So there's a lot of support for him. Everybody was pumped about Richard Pitino being extremely successful in his first season at Minnesota. But from there, really fell off. His last 6 seasons, they went 8 and 23, which is hugely concerning. Turned it around the next year and went 24 and 10. Another kind of slip to 15 and 17, 22 and 14 the year after. And then his last 2 seasons, he went 15 and 16 and 14 and 15 before he was ultimately ousted at Minnesota. In that time, he had 1 NCAA tournament win. And ironically enough, it was over Louisville and Chris Mack. So his 1 NCAA tournament win in 12 seasons is over Louisville. And it really took, if you remember going into that game, it felt like Louisville and Chris Mack were set up for failure. That was, if you remember, that was the very first game of the NCAA tournament. It was that 12-15 game on Thursday afternoon. Louisville just couldn't get things going, and Minnesota, who was a terrible shooting team coming into the game, just could not miss. They were just knocking down threes left and right. And I think that's when people started to really take notice that they didn't like Chris Mack's pack line defense that was set up to let guys just shoot threes nonstop. So ultimately, not great success at Minnesota, but then he goes to New Mexico and really got things going there. They had just an okay season his first year, really turned it around in year 2, and they were solid, kind of up and down. They were 8 and 5, I believe, against tournament teams in 2023-24. But again, none of those were Power 5 teams. Not a single win over a Power 5 team. So that's the negative stuff. You want to take everything with a little bit of a grain of salt because, FIU, Minnesota, and New Mexico are not like premier brand names by any means. When you're playing in those leagues, you have to consider that he's not recruiting Power 5 type guys. He's recruiting guys that are supposed to come to a program like Minnesota, come to a program like New Mexico. So when he steps up to a place like Louisville, do things change a little bit? And I guess that's the question, and where you look at the silver lining in this is the fact that he's going to step it up significantly in the NIL that he gets. I've looked into New Mexico's NIL, setup. They do it just like Louisville, where they have an official NIL partner. And from everything that we've heard, they were like around about $1 million in NIL, which is not terrible by any means for a program
more
like
than
that.
I thought it would be, honestly.
Yeah, that again, that was a number that was thrown out from, I think it was Drew Diener that threw that number out there, but that's not anything official. So when you look at the positives of this, if you look at Richard Pitino's career, right, going back to his first stint at Louisville, he came in and Louisville made an Elite Eight, I believe. They had a really good stretch, and then he took his defensive principles to Florida under Billy Donovan, and they went to another Elite Eight. He came back to Louisville for one season in 2012, and you have Peyton Siva, Stephen Van Treese, and a number of people coming out and saying, without Richard Pitino, we don't make a Final Four in 2012. A lot of people giving him his props for his role in that. So when you look at his assistant coaching record, he was really solid, especially the Power 5 level. And when you look at the way that he likes to play, especially this season, New Mexico was a very fast-paced team, one of the fastest-paced teams in the country this year, top 50 in both offense and defense on KenPom. And he brings that, pressure, in-your-face pressure, full court press sometimes, similar to what his father did. But he also brings a lot of those Billy Donovan principles as well. A lot of his offensive principles he takes from Billy Donovan's days at Florida. And then the other positive, obviously, is the fact that this is the first, I would say, surprisingly, maybe even more than like a Scott Drew. It's the first time you see a huge group of Louisville fans really getting behind one of these coaching candidates. And that's interesting to me. I don't know if it's the name. I don't know if it's the fact that he knows what this job means. I'm not sure. What's your take on that? Why is there such a positive vibe around this?
I think it kind of shocked me as well. I thought that more people would be of the mind that I was, that when you hear Richard Pitino, you kind of think of disappointment. Because I think when he first took over at Minnesota 2013, 2014, and he wins 25 games, you're thinking, shit, Pitino retires in 2023, 2024. And in 10 years, we're bringing in Richard. And Richard's cruising us for another 30 years. We go Denny, Rick, Richard. At least that's what I was thinking back then. And then he goes on to have up and down seasons, more down than up. Gets fired from a bottom dwelling Big Ten school because even there, 14 wins a season doesn't cut it. Has done okay at New Mexico, but hasn't really ever made the mark that I think people expected him to make with that name and how well he did his first year. So to me, I was kind of surprised. I go back. I think it's because of the name Pitino. If his name was Richard Smith and people saw this blind resume of a barely above 500 winning percentage overall and 3 NCAA tournament appearances with 1 NCAA tournament win, with recruiting rankings when he was at Minnesota no higher than 30th. He had 2 years, 34th and 30th in 2015, 2016. That's it. I don't really know, without this last name, does that really get people as excited as they are? And to me, I don't think so. Now, I do agree with the play style. I think that he will bring familiarity to the play style with intense defense, not full court pressure the whole entire time like Rick was, but you'll occasionally see that, especially when it's necessary. And an offense that's pretty modern. They're definitely more defensive oriented than they are offensive oriented, but I think he would bring some play styles that would make the fan base happy. But to me, I think without this last name, I don't think that you get the fan base excited. Now, if they go make a run in the tournament this year and they beat Clemson and they beat Baylor, and now they're scheduled to play in the Sweet 16, I could see people getting really excited and I would understand it. But to me, I don't think the body of work is there.
Yeah, man. I mean, it's really tough to say because, we compare right now, you're comparing Richard Pitino to Josh Schertz, Pat Kelsey, maybe why am I blanking on the guy over at Seton Hall?
Shaheen Holloway.
Shaheen Holloway, thank you. Sorry, there's just so many names in the mix. You just get a little confused
It's all of the
sometimes.
names.
When you compare their track records, I mean, I don't know. When you look at College of Charleston, Pat Kelsey's been there for a long time, and they've just been okay his entire time there. He's been like top 4 in the conference pretty much the whole time he's been there, but no wins in the NCAA tournament. But then you look at who they play in the NCAA tournament, a team like College of Charleston, they draw a team like they did this year in Alabama pretty much every season. And they seem to play pretty well against those teams. But man, I don't know. Pat Kelsey, he just doesn't get me excited. Now, one thing I'll say about all these guys, and the reason that I think my suspicion would be that Josh Hurd, excuse me, is going after these guys specifically is because their personalities fit well with the program. When you look at a Pat Kelsey, when you look at a Josh Schertz, when you look at a Richard Pitino, these are guys that not only will handle the way that Louisville fans are, I mean, as we've seen over the last few weeks, just absolutely nuts. Not only will they handle that well, but they'll embrace that, like a Jeff Brom has, like a like a Dan McDonald has, like a Jeff Walls has. You have to have somebody like that running this program. And for all the great things that we had to say about Scott Drew, Dusty May, and some of these similar names, they don't have that personality. They don't strike you as guys that are going to want to embrace the fan base. They don't strike you as guys that you're going to, show up to a baseball game and Scott Drew's sitting there, right? So I think you have that in all of these guys. I think any of these guys would bring the energy to get you fired up. They'd come in at that opening press conference and kind of get you on board a little bit. I really like Josh Schertz's personality. I think he's just asshole-ish enough. I think the same with Pat Kelsey. I think he's a guy that, people would kind of, like whatever, not care about that kind of hire. And he'd come in and have a chip on his shoulder. He'd be that type of dude. And I think the same way about Richard Pitino. I think that's a guy that would come in. He understands the weight of being the head coach at Louisville. He understands the pressure. He understands the expectations. He has a good grasp on how things were back in the early 2000s, the 2010s. He gets what this means to the city, to the fan base, to the program as a whole. The other thing as well that I'm keeping in mind is the kind of coaching staff that could be assembled. I have on good authority, I think Mark Lieberman would be really interested in joining a coaching staff with Richard Pitino. And, you like the experience that he has on his coaching staff now. Isaac Chu is one of his top assistants. He spent time at Murray State, Missouri, Marquette, Virginia Tech, Texas A&M, Grand Canyon. They just brought in a guy in Tarvish Felton 2 years ago. And he has been at New Mexico for over 20 years, and, in some way, shape, or form. Also been in the Mountain West for, the last 10, the previous 10 seasons with Fresno State as well. I'm not sure if those are guys that he'd want to bring over, but, when you look around the college coaching landscape, I think you could bring in a few big up and coming names, guys that are looking to get to the next level, kind of like how Chris Mack did, right? You look back at that Chris Mack staff, and it was really solid. I mean, look at Murray at UConn. Hurley has kind of credited Murray with coming in and kind of rebranding their offense, and obviously is known as a really good recruiter.
Mike Dino at the Jefferson County Penitentiary.
But I mean, Dino, obviously a former head coach, a solid coach in his own right. Obviously, things really fell off at the end there. But no, there's some solid names on his staff. I don't know if he'd bring anybody over, but like you said as well, he has some quality players there that he could bring over. And just like we talked about with Dusty May, I think that, you could have some exciting players follow Richard Pitino over as well. Any thoughts on how things would go recruiting wise for him? I would think it would be pretty similar to what Rick did.
I don't know. It's tough to say because Rick lived in a world where NIL wasn't as big of a player. So, I mean, who knows? I mean, if what Rick Pitino's doing now at St. John's, from what I've heard, they have pretty comparable financial numbers to what Louisville has in NIL, around 3 to 4 million for their basketball team per year. And I mean, they just brought in a 9-10 man. I mean, they let go of every single player except one guy last year. So I think it would be a little bit improved if he fully dives into NIL. And it's hard to know because Richard's never had that kind of money before. And I think that money can go a long way if he's not like Kenny Payne and says, no, I want players here for the right reason. I don't want them to come here for NIL. I want them to come because they want to be a Louisville Cardinal or whatever. I think the only thing that gives me pause is, like I talked about earlier, he's never had a recruiting class higher than 30th. And if you look at the numbers from 2013 to 2021, it was 89th, 64th, 34th, 30th, 71st, 45th, 36th, 53rd, 98th. Like, unless he's going to dominate the transfer portal, those really aren't recruiting rankings that are going to be able to give you consistently winning teams the way that our fans are expecting to win. So that gives me a little bit of pause, but I think with this NIL collective, with all the support that we have, I think anyone can do well. Not anyone, any good coach can do well here, whether it's Richard Pitino or Pat Kelsey or Josh Schertz. I think that anybody of their ilk can succeed here.
Mr. and Mrs. is for everyone, from a more traditional 90 proof to a cash string that's smoother. In 2013, Russ going to the hole, and boy, could we use that right now. Mr. and Mrs. Bourbon covers tastes, all different taste and preferences, 6 different bourbons that they're offering. Be among the first to try Mr. and Mrs. Bourbon, the official bourbon of the state of Louisville, and the Starting 502 Podcast, on shelves anywhere you find your liquor, and now online at mrandmrsbourbon.com.
Yeah, I mean, let's talk a little Josh Schertz. When I assess,
yes, please.
If you're assessing the guys that are the big names right now, the guys that we have left on the board, the thing that I love about Schertz, and it's something that really makes me feel like positive feelings about Pitino, is the fact that they have a plan in place. Every player knows what they're supposed to be doing on the court. They run a fun style on offense. They run I wouldn't say Schertz as much, but Pitino runs a really, familiar defense, right? And so with Josh Schertz, though, I mean, sitting here watching him, he runs a very modern, almost NBA style offense. A lot of unbalanced sets. You're setting guys up to have the post player make a play, a lot of screening action, a lot of, getting guys open, driving towards the bucket. It's what we hope to see under Kenny Payne, right? We hoped that he would come in and bring some sort of knowledge of X's and O's and some sort of solid foundation, some sort of solid system. We didn't get that at all under Kenny Payne. And, when I watch Josh Schertz, every player on the floor at every moment is moving. Every guy knows their job. Nobody's trying to do too much for the most part. I know tonight they've been a little sloppy, but I try not to take into consideration, I'm not going to live or die by the results of this game against Cincinnati in the NIT, because at this point, every fan and every player knows whenever they lose, it's Josh Schertz's last game there, regardless of the situation. So that's got to be a tough thing to overcome. And I try not to weigh that too much. But I mean, even tonight, when you look at the way that this offense is run, it's pretty entertaining. And he's done a great job of, getting players that really fit his system. I mean, what are your thoughts? I know you're a big guy on tape study. What do you see in Josh Schertz's offense if he ultimately ends up being the guy?
Yeah, I mean, I think regardless of this result right here, I mean, right now they're up 75-72 against Cincinnati. I mean, that's impressive. I don't think people it's Indiana State. Indiana State has been so bad for the last since Larry Bird graduated or left for the NBA. Like they've been so bad. So like for him to be in this situation with this team, beating a fringe tournament team, middle of the pack, Big 12 team, like that speaks volumes in and of itself right there. You look at his offensive rating, they're top 10 this year, and you just watch them play, and it's it's what we wanted to see on either side of the ball last year, especially for offense with Josh Schertz. It's like, that every player on the court knows exactly what their role is and knows exactly what they can do, whether they're off ball or whether they're on ball. When a shot goes up, when a pass is made, whatever it is, like they are almost always in the right position. They're always looking to cut off ball. They're always looking to make that extra pass. It's a lot of high IQ plays. We talked about it, a month and a half ago, whenever I think we randomly brought up Josh Schertz, which at that time we were still thinking Scott Drew, Nate Oates, Eric Musselman, someone of that kind of caliber of name. But we talked about it. It's a very European style. The ball swings freely. He's got big men that have skill. There's I can't remember his name. There's a freshman big man. He's kind of built a lot like Robbie Avila. Avila. I still don't know how to say his name.
Yeah.
If you watch him, he plays a lot like him. He's got the 3-point shot. He knows how to pass from the high post. So like Josh Schertz very clearly knows the kinds of players that he wants and the kinds of players that can succeed in his system. And if he's able to get these kind of guys at Indiana State, imagine what he can do with $3.75 million in NIL and an ability to go get almost anyone he wants to come play in his system. Like the limiting factors at Indiana State are insane. And he's been able to do this at Indiana State. So to me, I think I would be most excited with Josh Schertz. I know people weren't super excited about his name early on, just because you're comparing him to Nate Oates. You're comparing him to Scott Drew. And of course, I want Nate Oates. I want Scott Drew over Josh Schertz. But with the names we have now, to me, I think I had the most confidence in him as a coach. Recruiting and transfer portal, I think, will be the biggest question. But I think in year one, most likely he's got 3 guys that are averaging more than 16 points a game right now on this Indiana State team. They're all underclassmen. They can all transfer with him. Bring in 3 or 4 guys from the Sycamores team. Keep Ty Lore, keep Brandon Huntley Hatfield, keep Sky Clark. That's a base of 6 really, really solid players. You go and bring in 3 more transfers and maybe a top 50 recruit that ends up decommitting from a school. And like, that's a tournament team right there. And if he succeeds in year one, that's going to roll over. And in year 2, people are going to want to come play for him. Recruits are going to want to come play for Louisville. They're going to want to play in his system. So to me, I think of the guys we have remaining, Pat Kelsey, Josh Schertz, Richard Pitino, I have the most confidence in his ability to succeed at Louisville and succeed quickly.
Yeah, I mean, you look at what Louisville had on the roster this year. Brandon Huntley Hatfield is a guy that could play that Robbie Avila type of position, right? He's a guy that can pop out and make threes. He's a guy that has plenty of post moves. He's a better passer than people give him credit for, hard worker. I can, look at this existing Louisville roster and see where they would fit right in with his scheme. The one thing that gives me pause with Josh Schertz is the defense. They have the 18th ranked offense on KenPom, number 1 in the country in 2-point field goal percentage. They make 63% of their 2-point shots this season. That's insane. That's like, every team playing Louisville this season.
Literally, I was just about to say that's the field goal percentage we saw against every opponent last year.
Indiana State, one of the highest ranked net teams ever to not make the NCAA tournament. They finished 40th in KenPom this season, 18th ranked offense, but the 104 ranked defense. And so that's something to take into consideration as well. when you watch their defense, it's pretty simple man-to-man principles. Not switching on a lot of ball screens or anything like that. Nothing too complicated. It seems like, when they win, they try to outscore teams. And the way to beat them was like how Drake did in their conference championship, where they just shoot the freaking lights out. Drake doesn't shoot 60% from three in that game. And we could still be watching Indiana State in the NCAA tournament. So something to take into consideration, though, when you look at Richard Pitino versus Josh Schertz, a Pitino coach team, I'm thinking he's going to be a top 50, top 100 defense year in and year out. Could be wrong on that, but based on the principles that he brings to the table, just like how Rick Pitino was, right? A lot of pressing, a lot of high ball pressure. Like, that's something that would excite me, to see that back, especially with how abysmal. I mean, Louisville had the worst Power 5 defense 2 years in a row. I mean, one of the worst defenses in the country.
We were consistent.
They are consistent. And there you go. There's Robbie Avila hitting a three to take the lead with 1 minute left in the game. Man,
Josh is doing his best right now to get this job.
He is, man. He is, but he's going to make it weird, though.
I know.
Can
I ask you a question?
Yeah.
So right now, after what was it, nearly 4 years with Chris Mack, nearly 4 years, not great offense, good to solid defense, and then you go to Kenny Payne, I would say okay offense, abysmal defense.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think fans, if they had their choice in a coach, he can either be a offensive guru like Josh Schertz, or he can be that more Richard Pitino, defensive consistency, top 50 defensive efficiency every single year. What do you think fans want at this point? Because to me, the defense was so fucking infuriating this year. Like, it just made you feel helpless as a fan. But at the same time, watching Josh Schertz coach gets me so excited to think of having that as my guy every single year for the next 25 years. Man,
this might sound like a cop-out, but I think fans are going to like whatever wins.
Yeah.
I know that sounds silly, but if it's one thing to say, like, say Josh Schertz comes in and Louisville plays 8 of their first 10 games against like 200 plus ranked KenPom teams, which is probably something that's very likely. I think that fans would get really excited about that because they'll probably be scoring 80, 90, 100 points every single game. But then he's a guy that once you get into ACC play, once you get, towards the tournament and it's down to crunch time and you got to start pulling out some of these games against a Virginia Tech or a Wake Forest or something like that, and they start dropping some of these games because they have a bad shooting night and they just can't get it done on the defensive end. I think a lot of people are going to wish that they had Richard Pitino, to be honest with you. I don't think Richard Pitino is the guy that's going to come in. Like, I think if Richard Pitino came in, got a good crop of players under him, maybe 6 or 7, highly rated transfers, that kind of thing, and starts to assimilate them into the program, you could have some games where you're playing like Southwestern Louisiana and you win 62-48 and people are kind of freaking out. So I think initially fans might get a little bit more excited about Schertz's play. But I mean, I think when you look at overall body of work, as far as what he's consistently done, I like what Richard Pitino brings to the table as far as he has that Pitino style pressure defense. And he has a more modern offense than what his dad ran. So, ultimately, to start out, I think that maybe Schertz would kind of, they could come out with their hair on fire type of thing. And people could say, wow, this is really exciting. Like, I could see a lot of promise with this, but the defensive principles concern me. And that would be one of the first things, if ultimately he is the guy, that would be one of the first questions I hope is asked is, what's your philosophy on defense? What do you, defense wins championships. Do you believe that you can have a top 50 type of defense? Do you believe that just from what I've seen, just a very basic man-to-man principles, do you think that can get it done? So I know that's kind of a roundabout way of answering it. Winning will excite people the most. Winning, right. Period.
I will say I looked at it. They had a top 60 defensive efficiency rating last year. Then the year prior, it was it was below 150. So very clearly defense is not of the priority for them. So I am with this Josh Schertz thing. What have you heard about with this memorandum of understanding? Because it's confusing on how legally binding it is, but we've heard it's a 7-figure payment, which is very ambiguous. You don't know if that's 1 million or if that's 999 or 9,999,000.
Right.
And then I've heard people talking about Louisville's not going to pay that 7-figure payment to get him. But if it's in that 1 million, that's what you're paying to get Richard Pitino. So that doesn't really make sense to me unless Josh Schertz just doesn't want to be a bad guy, doesn't want to go back on his word, something like that. So I guess I'm a little confused on this whole memorandum of understanding thing.
Yeah, I mean, well, and to answer kind of the second part of that, we're not the guys that are in the room with Josh Schertz, right? Like we're not having those conversations. So ultimately, it's my hope that, and I wrote about this a lot today as well. It'll be up on stateoflouisville.com in the morning. I wrote about the fact that, you gotta let Josh take his time to make the right hire. The last 2 times that Louisville hired a coach, it was either baked in or there was just immense pressure coming from, high prominent boosters in the program to make a hire. And the 2 ADs at the time of those hires were not in permanent positions, and they needed to get in the good graces of the ADs. For the first time since Tom Jurich hired Rick Pitino in 2001, this is really the first time that we've had an athletic director that just in administration, we always say, oh, it's Josh Hurd. I mean, there's, 3 dozen people that have their hands in this, right? But for the first time in, 2 decades plus, Louisville has a coaching search where it really just kind of lies in the hands of the decision makers. I mean, we're not the guys that are getting paid whatever it is, $850,000 a year to make this decision. Our career doesn't ride on this. So I'd say that number one. Number two, what I understand from the MOU, from my, very brief Googling and, just reading up on what the history of people getting out of this kind of stuff is, I see it as like it operates almost as like it would be Louisville buying out Josh Schertz from St. Louis now. So instead of paying a buyout to Indiana State, it would be to St. Louis instead, because he's already contractually obligated in some way to go to St. Louis. So that's my understanding. I don't know if Louisville has to take the brunt of that. I don't know. I'm not sure how that works. I really don't know. And I'm not sure if that's something that off the bat that Josh Hurd would have known about either. So this has kind of come out of nowhere, man. I from what I can best ascertain, that's kind of how it would go, though. They would have to essentially be in negotiations now with St. Louis and with Josh Schertz, and kind of quote unquote buy him out of that agreement. So that's my very basic understanding. We could have this totally wrong, maybe. And the other thing too is my understanding is that this can vary based on the verbiage of the contract. It really depends on what he signed to. Is it like, okay, we said 7 figures. So say he signed a $1.5 million contract for his first year. Did they just have to buy him out of that first year contract? I'm not really sure how that works. And buyouts work differently for every program. So for instance, a program like Louisville with Kenny Payne's and Chris Mack's buyouts, right? It was structured as such that in the first year, it was like something ridiculous, like $12 million, like untouchable. And then each subsequent year it drops. So it'd be like 10 million, 8 million, 6 million. That's kind of how Louisville would structure it. Other programs, I was looking at like, I was trying to remember who it was, maybe like a Pat Kelsey where basically your buyout is what's left on your contract. So the program that would be buying them out would have to pay the remainder of the contract. So say you sign a new contract for 6 years and it incrementally goes up $500,000 a year. So you just do that math, and then whatever's left on the contract, that's what you would have to pay them out. So I'm not sure how his is structured. I'm not sure how this situation is set up, but from what I can best ascertain, it really just depends on how the contract is worded. And it seems like this is like a private negotiation, which is why nobody knew about it before. But from what I can best tell, the quote unquote payment or buyout for Schertz would be very similar to the range of what they would have to pay to buy out Richard Pitino. Is that a decent explanation?
Yeah. I think it definitely helps. I think my final question is, do you kind of feel pressure? I know the Michael Ajayi from Pepperdine just committed to Gonzaga. I guess I'm starting to get to the point where you saw those teams that didn't make the tournament, all those players hit the portal. Now you're seeing teams that did make the tournament, like New Mexico, Jamal Mashburn Jr.'s in the portal, those kind of guys.
Right.
Do you feel a sense of urgency is necessary to get this hire done? Because obviously, if it's Richard Pitino, if it's Pat Kelsey, there's really no reason to wait. Get him in here as quickly as possible so that he can assemble a coaching staff and he can start getting those transfers in as quickly as possible. With Josh Schertz, you have to wait until he gets out of the NIT. You can have the agreement already made up, but he's going to stay there. He's not going to leave this team in the middle of an NIT run to potentially get a championship, as it looks like they're going to beat Cincinnati. So are you starting to kind of feel that, like, because I'm watching these guys and you're seeing some of those top names, they're taking visits to St. John's, they're committing to Gonzaga, and I'm like, shit, we're already behind the 8 ball. This is going to make it more difficult. And so every day that goes by, I guess I'm feeling a little more antsy.
Yeah, I mean, that's a kind of a loaded question, right? Because I think that it'll be really indicative of what the next move is based on what happens in the next 24 hours. I mean, Indiana State basically has a free throw to seal the deal right now. If they're going to the NIT Final Four, then you basically have as much as another week to week and a half left before you can make anything official or have any sort of conversations about that. And of course, they just missed the free throw. Let's see what happens here. Okay.
Hey, but guess what Josh Schertz just did?
What?
He just did what Dusty May didn't do. Up 3 in the bonus. Cincinnati's in the bonus. He fouls right there, so they got to shoot 2 free throws.
Great situational awareness. Great situational awareness there. And what a cluster at the end of that FAU game, by the way.
That was I was watching it. I put money on FAU kind of blindly just because I was supporting Dusty May, because at that time it was assumed that he was our next head coach, and kind of watching the end of that game kind of made me be like, okay, maybe he isn't this guy, which Northwestern was a better team than I realized. I knew they had Boo Buie, but they had a few more players than I guess I realized. But that end of game coach management with the no fouling, up 3, and not calling a timeout right there at the very end of the game when it's very clear they have nothing set and it's just going to be a pull-up 3 from 30 feet away, made me question a little bit, because those are big moments. I mean, you at a level of program like this, you need a coach that can steal you 2 or 3 wins every single year, that pushes you from 22-14 to 25-12 or 25-11 or whatever, and get you in the tournament. And that kind of made me worry a little bit.
Yeah, that was ugly and very concerning. I also think that you had, just like how Josh Schertz is right now, you had Dusty May, where, these conversations are happening, right? Mm-hmm. Like, he's already prepared to go wherever at the time, it was at least 3 other schools that he was, maybe not him personally, but his representation was in contact with. It's really tough to assess what happens, but I think, now that it appears that Josh Schertz is going to be moving on for another week, I think if we don't hear anything, then that's probably indicative of Schertz still definitely being in the running. But from everything that we're hearing, it sounds like, if it's going to be Richard Pitino, we'd probably find out pretty soon, as long as he pulls the trigger. I think that maybe they'd be, if he is the guy, they'd be asking for a response here in the next 48 hours. So I think we'll find out something pretty quickly, man.
I can't wait for everything we've just said in this podcast to be completely irrelevant.
Yeah.
We literally in the last like 48 hours, it's been, or I guess maybe 72 hours, it's been insane. It was, we have Dusty May, we don't have Dusty May. Okay, Shaheen Holloway. No, Shaheen Holloway is not the guy. Then we hear Josh Schertz is interested in talking about Will Wade. He's talking about Will Wade. Nope, never mind. We're not going to do Will Wade. Then on Monday, it's Josh Schertz. Josh Schertz is the guy. Josh Schertz is the guy. If he wants the job, it's his job. Then we hear about memorandum of understanding with St. Louis. And then all of a sudden we hear Richard Pitino is a candidate. So I'm just like, another 24 hours, we're going to have another 6 like head coaching candidates out there. Like David Levitch is at some point going to pop up on this coaching search. Like I'm just sure of it. We've heard of every name at this point. So I'm excited.
Tom Crean.
I think someone in a Twitter space I was listening to suggested Tom Crean, and I was like, Jesus Christ, this is when we've been in the coaching search marketplace for too long. But I'm excited. I'm going to support, regardless of what I say. I'm going to support whoever it is. It will be better than what we've had, and whatever coach comes in will be set up to succeed. I know that for sure.
So here's the bad news, because I just did some quick research here. Next Tuesday is the NIT semifinals in Hinkle Fieldhouse. The championship game will be next Thursday, April 4th. So if Josh Schertz continues winning, you could be looking at like April 5th as your date, which is, then you're really up against it. You really are. So I don't know. Yeah, I think you're right in a sense, man. I think you're right that, if you have to wait to have these conversations, maybe it's not worth it. You want to get a guy that can hit the ground running, that can immediately start hitting the transfer portal, that can immediately start recruiting, that can immediately start having these conversations, trying to get a coaching staff together, everything that's associated with that. If you think about when Kenny Payne came in, it was early March. He didn't take advantage of that opportunity, but he had the opportunity to start recruiting, to start assembling a staff right away. And I think that'll be the expectation. If you hire a Richard Pitino, he's probably not going to sleep for 72 hours, right? Like it's just going to be a whirlwind. But you see how quickly this stuff operates. When you look at Michigan, when you look at, trying to think of another, there's been a few other, pretty solid coaching hires recently, and they just pop real quick. Like a team gets knocked out of the tournament, the next day there's a hire.
Yeah, West Virginia hired DeVries.
West Virginia
within I think 2 days after he got knocked out of the tournament.
Yeah. So it'll move quickly. So that's probably why we should wrap this up now, because
there's going to be another coaching candidate out there.
It could be now. Yeah. If you're listening to this on Wednesday afternoon, on the 27th of March, things may have changed. The data may have changed. So we'll let the cake bake. We will wait until, we'll wait over the next 24, 48 hours. We'll get back on here. We'll have these talks again. As of right now, gut feeling. What's your gut feeling? What do you think is going to happen?
I want it to be Josh Schertz, but I think with this memorandum of understanding, with the fact that he keeps winning in the NIT, you're possibly not getting him for another 10 days. I think it might be Richard Pitino, because I think from what we've heard, if Richard gets that offer, he's going to take it, and he can come in immediately.
I'm with you there, man. Like I think that, again, we didn't really get into this. I kind of started to get into this and we branched off a little bit, but I think that when I look at the coaching candidates, I think that Richard Pitino has a higher floor. He's a guy that he's just been there, done that. He he understands the nature of the business. He understands what this program means. With that in mind, I think that if you're looking at wanting to make the tournament right away, like I've said from the jump, whoever you hire, the expectation doesn't change. You need to make the tournament this season. You got to show us something right away. You got to show us that, with your recruiting acumen, with your coaching prowess, with your X's and O's knowledge, with your ability to assemble a coaching staff, with your ability to manage the program, that you can get this thing, back on track right away. And with that in mind, I think Richard Pitino has a higher floor, but I do think a guy like Josh Schertz has a higher ceiling because of what he brings to the table, because of his knowledge. There's not many better strategists out there right now. At least, that would be on the Louisville market, right? So I'll kind of leave it at that, but I'm with you, man. I think that Richard Pitino, just gut feeling, I think that they're going to do what they can to make this happen. We've already heard a lot about, a lot of boosters have come out and said, I'm willing to give more if it's Richard Pitino. We're already seeing, they could probably get more NIL money. They could probably bring in a really quality coaching staff. They could probably do the things that are necessary to get this program going in the right direction right away. And so for that reason, I think that just gut feeling, for the sake of, bringing this fan base back together, I think it could be Richard Pitino, man. I like, just something in my gut tells me, from everything that we've been hearing, if he accepts this job, I think he's the guy.
Yep, I agree. And I agree with you there. I think the floor is higher, but I think that ceiling is also a little lower, because I think Josh Schertz could be very easily that next coach that we get for another 25 years. And we're riding him out to multiple Final Fours, a national championship, maybe 2. I could definitely see that in the future, but timing is a fickle matter. And, it might come down to that, honestly, and the memorandum of understanding. So, but who knows? By the time this thing airs, who knows where we're at?
Yeah. Honestly, I need to go check Twitter and see what's going on now.
There's probably another name we haven't seen yet.
Probably. All right, guys. Well, that's going to wrap it up for tonight. Thank you for tuning in. Make sure that you hit that subscribe button, because we will be just kind of, as you've seen, 3 episodes in 6 days, basically. We're going to be kind of rapid firing these at this point, just getting updates as soon as we can get them, bringing you what our best understanding of the situation is, and just kind of going from there. Make sure you drink Mr. and Mrs. Bourbon. Again, available at store.mrandmrsbourbon.com. A lot of great stuff coming from them as well, with their special super secret limited releases. Until next time, Starting 502 Podcast. Let's get out of here. And as always, go Cards.
Go Cards.